And Pamela Shrestha were based in the US but wanted to encourage us at the Social Science Baha to support Nepal scholars. And I say Nepal scholars because it includes non-Nepalis as well, but basically scholars who've written, talked about, and tried to help understand Nepal. I also want to say a special word of welcome to Katrin, who's here today at the lecture, and want to thank her for her support and recognize the importance of the subject today of commemorating Toni Hagen's work. You've all received the promotional materials that we circulated by email and handed to you as you entered, so I won't bother to go into the details of it, and my colleague and friend Dipak Gyawali will be talking today about his life, Toni Hagen's life, and focusing on how he began as one disciplinarian and ended up as another, and along the way spanned several disciplines. And I found myself resonating with the interdisciplinarity of his work through his time in Nepal, and I think that's what's lacking a lot these days in development discourse. Some housekeeping points. We will run for about 45 minutes with Dipak speaking, and then we'll have question and answer for about 30 to 45 minutes again. Tea and cookies are served after the interaction. Bathrooms, toilets are at the back outside the room. I'll ask that you please mute your mobile phones. I'm sure most of you have done it, but I thought I might remind you. I also want to say that a bibliography of Toni Hagen's writings is being prepared, and is to be published as part of the Martin Chautari bibliography series. Pratyush, do we know at what stage we are at in terms of publication?
It's ready to go.
He's an old friend. He was one of the founding members of the Social Science Baha, so hosting you today. Many of you know him personally in any case and have read the introduction that's been provided, but I should just say that he also has sought through his work to be interdisciplinary. He chairs the Interdisciplinary Analysts Company in Kathmandu, which has done a lot of evidence-based work in recent times, including surveys and other things. He has served as a minister in a government in Nepal in the recent past, and has thoughtful things to say about water resource governance. I'm really delighted that he agreed, despite his busy travel schedule, to join us and celebrate the life and work of Toni Hagen. So Dipak, you've got about 40 minutes. I'll give you a warning 10 minutes ahead.
I'd first like to begin by actually thanking Nanda and Pamela Shrestha for this endowment grant to the Social Science Baha. You know, traditionally in our part of the world, it used to be said that if you gave grants and gifts to Brahmins, Dharma would be preserved. The modern version of it is that if you endow universities and social science Bahas, definitely knowledge gets transferred to the next generation and gets preserved in the process. So both of them we owe thanks to them for doing this, householders' duty to Brahmins, I guess, modern Brahmins that we are here. I will first begin with a very personal reflection about Toni Hagen, discuss his writings, and then I'll focus on a few key critical areas that I too have been part of. There are many other areas that I have not been, so I can't speak too much about it. And then finally reflect about what it means and why much of it is still relevant today. So many years after he's passed, it's over a decade and a half that he's passed away. Strangely, it turns out I met Toni Hagen when I was in the 3rd standard in St. Xavier's Jowlin School. And Father Moran, our principal, used to take us for a walk. And it happened to be that me, my cousin Prabhat Dixit, several of us were going, and he took us to what is now the SATA office, but they were all, I think that's where they had their first office. Memory is vague. But I remember that, we were small kids, and Father Moran and what I later learned was Toni Hagen and a couple of others that I don't remember or recognize, were sitting on around a table, and there was a big sort of wheel of cheese there, which we'd never seen. We didn't know what it was, and these guys were all very excited about it. Don't ask me whether it was actually first cheese done here or brought. Don't ask me. But what they were doing was they had this funny kind of a screw, and they used to screw that barrel, pull out the screw, and then open it up, and there would be a small cylinder of cheese which they broke and tasted, and then they broke off that waxy part and plugged it back in. Which probably explains the holes in Swiss cheese, I guess, But, they're all excited by it, and we were also asked to taste a bit, and as far as I can remember, it tasted stank and it tasted awful. It's an acquired taste like beer, I guess, and I'm, a great fan of, blue cheese and all right now. So the blame goes to Toni Hagen and Father Moran, I guess. This is way back in I think it was 1959, if I'm not mistaken. Now, the second one is, can you just go to the next one slide? I don't have any slides, this is the only one. In this picture, this is not Toni Hagen, okay? That's my father with the then Australian High Commissioner, Ambassador, in Birganj railway station. And my father's book very clearly mentions, Toni Hagen's book doesn't mention my father's name, but he does mention that a government official came to receive him at the Raxol-Birganj border and saw them off to Amlechganj. Now, my father then was in the, he had a double duty under the Rana, last days of the Rana rule, which doesn't happen very often. He was part of the Qatar Bahan Apiladda, which was in Kalaya. So he was sort of like a district judge, I guess you would say. But at the same time, he was also he was answerable to Vijay Shamsher, Mohan Shamsher's son, who was de facto foreign minister of Nepal. So his duty was also what would today be called chief of protocol. So he was to receive all the foreign visitors there and send them off to Amlechganj, from where they walked up to Chitlan Pass and came to Kathmandu. My father mentions in his book that the people he literally gave visas to on arrival at Birganj was Toni Hagen, Father Moran, Professor Tucci, the Indologist from Italy, and a few others, eminent people like that, is my father writes in his book. He didn't write in the book, but I remember him telling me that the first thing that Toni Hagen apparently asked, and it must have been an extremely wonderfully clear day, because on a really clear day from Birganj you can see a bit of the mountain. So his first question was, what is that mountain called? And like a true good Nepali, my father said, Himal. That's what I want to say. I remember. Go back to the other slide. Okay. Now, my other interaction with him was that in this book, Ropeways in Nepal, we published with the help of Catherine and Monica, because Toni Hagen was already very weak by then, and his draft chapter had to go back and forth, and he was already very weak, so Catherine and Monica had to help us put that together. But it's possibly the last thing he wrote, okay? Which is a comparison of the wrong turn in infrastructure development that Nepal took with bad roads versus trunk roads, good trunk roads, and ropeways. So that's a very critical chapter, and it's also in his other writings. Okay? Incidentally, when my father probably gave Toni Hagen his visa, I was not yet born, but I was born literally about 6 or 5 months after that. Okay? And today, by the way, is my Nepali calendars. We count birthday by, 9 months in the womb is the first year. So today is my 70th birthday. And these 70 years have been intertwined with Toni Hagen and his work also. So this is a sort of an interesting coincidence. Now, I'll go through his list of publications. The list, as George mentioned, is being published, the bibliography by Martin Chautari. Social Science Baha and the Toni Hagen Foundation are going to make sure, I'm told, that all his collection writings, copies of them, including the ones in German, some of the more academic ones are in German, especially on geology, and have not been yet, I believe, translated. There are many academic such pieces, and they'll be brought together. So this is one of the purpose of this gathering in this commemoration is also to make sure that that is available to Nepali scholars in the future. Okay, it's also to inspire the newer researchers, not to reinvent, the bicycle, but to definitely improve and maybe redesign it. And much of that bicycle work has already been done. The advantage today we have is that much of his important works are already available in English. There are 4 publications that I will basically be talking about. These are in English, and they already tell you, especially for, let's say, a non-geologist, the very first publication, Nepal, as it was called, in 1961 it was published, but revised in 1998 by Himal Books, Dipak Gyawali, who's not here. It's about the best guide to geology of Nepal even today. And that is because Toni Hagen traveled 14,000 kilometers on foot all over Nepal, doing the first mapping and geological studies of the Himalaya. He was invited by the Swiss Forward Mission, as it was called, and the Ranas, Mohan Shamsher and all, who were anxious. Sardar Bhimbahadur Pandey was the one who organized all that from the Nepali side, from the London embassy. And he was selected to come here. And he had just begun, he had got excited about the Himalayas even as a young boy. And came here. But in all that walking around and mapping the Himalayas, it was the first time it was done. And so most people would have already been a lifetime work of amazing proportion, but he continued into other areas. So that is what is interesting. Now, I'll talk about that, basically these separate issues also later. But what is interesting about that book, Nepal, 1961, was it's the first major book that opened up Nepal or explained Nepal to the world. So that's important. Also important, it was twice banned by India. Ostensibly for a bad map of Kashmir as they saw it. But really, if you look at it, right from his description of what happened in 1950-51, the extreme high-handedness and interference of the Indian ambassador here, this is very nicely documented. So again, this is very relevant because that continues. So these are issues that I'll talk about more later. The second book that I find very interesting and important is this Building Bridges to the Third World, and it was translated from the German and published in English in 1994. Part 1 and 2 are of the period between 50 and 60, the Rana and post-Rana interregnum period. And this is where most of his field work is described, the field work in geology. But it's not only geology, but it's also geography. So the land had to be mapped, not just the rocks on the land, but the shape of the land and everything. So this was a monumental piece of work in geography also at that time. And let us not forget that geography is one of those few interdisciplinary disciplines, that transcends the natural and the social sciences. And I guess this is why in the process he had to force himself to also go from looking at rocks to looking at people that live on the rocks. Okay? The third part of the book is about from 1959 to 1962, and it's about the Tibetan refugees that he got involved with. Well, that was the time that they started streaming into Nepal after the Chinese takeover. And it's a very interesting set of writing there of what he had to do and what he did, which is still unique and has a tremendous implication for today's development. We'll talk slightly about that, But this whole idea of what rehabilitation after disaster means, what development really means, and all that is accounted there. There's also a very interesting and strange praise and criticism of King Mahendra at that time. Toni Hagen was a true Swiss Democrat, and he always argued for democracy, so he did not like what King Mahendra had done in 1960 with the Young Democracy then. But then he again sees that King Mahendra did take a very strong stand in the work that was being done for the Tibetan refugees against all Chinese pressures. So he sees that as an extremely bold and strong thing about the king. Part 4 is about development works and insights from 62 to 92. Now, between 62 and 72, he spent more time in Peru and Yemen and later in the Bangladesh refugee crises, in the Bangladesh War of Liberation, but did come to Nepal on and off in between and did some significant, still continued to do a lot of work with the Tibetan refugees and with development issues here in Nepal. But then after he retired from UNDP, he concentrated more on coming back to Nepal very frequently after that. And the third book is Decentralization and Development, the Role of Democratic Principles. And it's subtitled Some Comparisons Between Switzerland and Nepal in the Fields of Tourism, Hydropower and Infrastructure. Okay. It was published in 2012 posthumously. A lot of work done by Katrin here and Susanna von der Heide and others. And it's mostly stuff he had written but put together afterwards from his notes and a few other things. Okay. What's interesting there is also the second chapter, which is Rethinking Development. And much of Toni Hagen's views on development come from what I call toad's eye science, as opposed to eagle eye science. Looking at things from the perspectives high perched development agency, London, Washington DC, Denver, or even Bern, and actually seeing how things are at the grassroots, and that's extremely important. In that chapter, he also talks about Nepal's leap. It used to be said that Nepal, in that period, that half century, literally had to leap from the 14th century to the 20th century. And it's an amazing period of change that he sort of documents, lives through, reflects on, and has things to say. Refugees, disaster relief, the whole issue of large dams, the issue of poverty and what poverty eradication really should mean. And most important to me, and this is extremely important, what honest development cooperation is all about. It's extremely important. We'll talk more about it, but it's very important to today's debate as well. For instance, on dams, which we'll talk about later also, there's a chapter in a publication of ours, Water Nepal, the journal is called, with anthropologist and cultural theorist Mike Thompson, who's also given a lecture at the Social Science Baha, where he has a chapter called Huge Dam and Tiny Incomes. Okay? And the same thing was taken up by the Nepali macroeconomist Premchand Thapa later, discussing that issue. And what is remarkable is how Toni Hagen's views on what large dams and tiny incomes mean. How tiny incomes cannot sustain these large dams socially, developmentally, forget financially. And what it does to development and the lives of people afterwards is amazingly similar. The third chapter is about democracy and the Swiss model. And he has a blistering critique. Now, there are democracies and there are democracies, all kinds of democracies, but we just chose what India automatically chose, which was the British Westminster model, and we immediately copied that and continue to live with it today. But, Toni has a very blistering critique of that Westminster model there on several grounds. One of the important points he makes is that for young democracies, Westminster model is not very suitable simply because the Westminster model demands a party culture that takes years and centuries, if not centuries, to grow. And if that party culture is not there, you start getting extremely unholy alliances between individuals and things, which does not lead to stability and therefore good development. And he's also got some blistering critique about this whole thing about vote of no confidence, which is there in the Westminster model, but is not there in other democracies. They have other ways of expressing no confidence. This vote of no confidence leads to tremendous horse trading and instability, which we saw in the 90s of Nepal and continue to see also in recent times. Okay. Now, this is strangely, parallels a very nice interview I just saw the other day of Russian President Putin, who was asked this question by a student of international relations from Moscow State University, and his remark was almost exactly similar. He was asked, he's reforming the Russian whatever system right now, as you must be knowing, and he was asked, about this parliamentary method of democracy and all. And Putin said very clearly, there are all kinds of democracies. The French model is different, the American model is different, the British model is different, okay? And he said, that in Russia, Now, with all the horrible things done by the Communist Party, he said, there are no parties in Russia that are old enough with old enough culture to sustain a Westminster model. And so this is also interesting that this debate now, who's right, who's wrong is a different issue. But this debate about governance is something that we really have to, again, go back to, it looks like, here in Nepal. Chapter 4, he talks about the benefits of constitutional monarchy. Now, this is another very debatable chapter, okay? But his argument is, despite his criticism of King Mahendra and subsequent, praise for the manner in which he managed to survive between two competing regional powers, his argument is that this is, for a country like Nepal, perhaps a means of providing stability within a context of regional rivalry. And what that means to us today, now we become a republic, but then where is that search for that preservation of stability in our governance structure is something that again is part of a debate that will not go away. In the 5th chapter, it's about tourism, Swiss versus Nepali, and when he talks about the Swiss model of tourism development, which is grassroots up, versus the Nepali model, which has been top down, and which is where I have a bit of a disagreement with Toni Hagen on this, because my view is that compared to other sectors in Nepal, like hydropower or whatever, tourism still has been a sector developed mostly in Nepal in the 70s by the private sector. Which is why there is a culture of tourism, hospitality and management in Nepal that you do not find in India or any other place like that. You go to a remote village in Nepal and they probably know how to deal with tourists and guests much, much better than you find in some of the best 5-star hotels in India. Which is no wonder that most Nepalis who migrate out, you find them in restaurants and hotels and everywhere else. Okay? But that's because of this culture. So I'm not quite sure that Nepal was top down. In fact, where Nepal has attempted tourism top down, as with the creation of this useless, in my view, sorry for the strong word, this tourism development board or something like that, it's just a taxing mechanism and really hasn't done much to contribute to real tourism development, which the private sector has done a much better job in Nepal. 6th chapter is of hydropower, we'll talk about that. 7th chapter is about transportation and alternatives, and the 8th chapter is about rural poverty. So this book already gives a very comprehensive sort of a picture of all the summary of his work and insights. The 4th and final book recently came out last year, The Photos of Kathmandu Valley 1950-1960. Katrin is here and they managed to do a great bit of editing. Vajra Books brought it out. And it is important not just as a piece of history of photographs and things like that. It is useful in analysis of the process of change. Okay? Subikas versus kubikas, or apt versus mal development. Because development is such a loaded word that anything proposed in the name of development, if it's bad and you oppose it, you're accused of being anti-developmental. And that has not led to a healthy discourse in Nepal. Development can be both good or bad developments. I would personally support good development and really oppose bad development. But that, again, a parliamentary democracy that doesn't allow space for these dissenting voices to come. As the examples of, from Arun 3 to Nisgad to just about everything shows us today. Okay. Now, if we are to reverse or to correct mal to apt development, this collection of photographs is extremely useful as a reference for such planning. I remember a famous statement by an Israeli president at the funeral of John Kennedy, where he defined what tragedy was, and that's the best definition I've ever heard. He said, tragedy at Kennedy's funeral, who was killed so young, assassinated, he said, tragedy is the difference between what is and what might have been. So when you see this book on Kathmandu Valley's pictures by Toni Hagen, 1950-1960, you see the tragedy of Kathmandu, which is the difference between what is and what might have been instead of the mess and the great slumification that we have transformed this valley into. Now, I'll go to his journal and today's relevance quickly in 4 key areas. The first is geology and geography. Okay. Now, I am only a geologist to the extent as a hydropower engineer. I had to do some geology to figure out what dam foundations would be like. And we have Govinda Sharma Pokhran, my colleague here, who's Nepal's first hydrogeologist, and he, during question, I'm sure, can answer a lot of other questions. But this, at least for people like us who are not geologists per se, the first and the last of those two, the four publications I mentioned, give a really good account already. Now, what is significant about his work in geology, and I summarized brutally, is this is the first time mapping. Had never been done before, and is surprisingly valid even till today. Okay. The second is that he is influenced by the Swiss school of geology of those days, and there's a big debate. This is the time of the continental drift and Wagner and a whole lot of geologists. That debate is still on today, but we've got much better knowledge today with all the fancy technologies of iridium, tracing and all that. Okay. The upthrust of the Himalaya was a debatable point at that time. And the Swiss school of thought was a marginal school of thought at that point, but turned out to be extremely important. And Toni Hagen's application of that to understanding Nepal's geology is the concept of nappe. I'm pronouncing it correctly? Nappe. This is as the upthrust occurs. Now, most schools just say the Himalaya is upthrust and there is just erosion, Yeah, there is erosion. It's much more than that, because this upthrust actually, it's so high already that you get the material just flowing over and eroding much faster after that than would have otherwise. Now, this has tremendous implications for the work. At least in my area of hydropower, what this is important, and Toni Hagen's kind of geology is important, is we have a tendency to think of Nepal and hydropower as just water. No, those gorges that you see the river going down is a conveyor belt for both water and matter. And huge amounts of matter, let me tell you. And it has implications for how we build dams, whether we build them, for how long should we plan on having them pay back their period. Because Kosi alone produces 100 million cubic meters of silt every year. You impound a dam, you don't impound just the water, you impound all that eroding nappe stuff, That's the first issue of significance to us today. And our public discourse on hydropower and energy has completely ignored this, much to the grief of many of the private developers even today. There are significant private developers in Nepal. It's equal, their development is equal to that of the Nepal Electricity Authority. But then they're realizing that, all the sediment and all that is just throwing their economics out of the window, And the banks this year, some of the banks might go belly up because of that. Yeah, it's a very dangerous thing. It's very relevant till today. Okay, so overexposed banks. Okay. The second important thing about the geology is, Toni Hagen's. He was brought because the Ranas wanted to find out if there was lots of minerals and they could make money. Well, everybody wants to be a Sheikh of Araby. He said very bluntly, the geology already tells you this nappe formation and its erosion, really means forget petroleum. There is no petroleum in Nepal. The geology didn't allow the organic matters to be, come in large amounts and get compressed and massively to get their, the good stuff oozed out into oil and tar and everything like that. And whatever must have been done, compressed and produced, must have evaporated in geological time way long ago. So there is no petroleum. If there is, it is below the symbolics, and we know that there is some gas in Bangladesh. Okay, that's true. The second is that tied to this is the fact that there are no significant mineral deposits. It's the nature of the geology. It doesn't allow significant amount. There are pockets with tremendous amount of concentrated iron ore or zinc or magnesite or something in Kharidunga and all that, but not in amounts that would really allow for this kind of, Arabs exporting oil and becoming sheikhs of Araby. Okay. Now, what this means, that the implication of this is extremely important. He talks about the town of Those, and I had the good fortune to actually do my study with another Swiss group, Infras of Zurich, on rural-urban interlinkage, and I stayed in Those. Now, Those is the place that was the mechanical engineering workshop during the Rana days. And I had read that the 1924 treaty with the British stopped arms production there. But it turns out it was much more than arms production. It was actually metallurgical production of many other things, including bridges in Baglung and a few other things that came from there. Now all that went out of the window. Why? Because of this extreme trade liberalization. That's extremely significant in the sort of thing that Toni Hagen writes about. It's important. It's not economic enough to mine and export to Japan or China or something. But, and this is the point Toni makes, is that it is important for local handicraft. If we did it properly, it's very rich concentration of good ore, which we could produce for our own handicraft. But we threw all that out the window, and much of our handicraft now comes from Kashmir and China, okay, marketed as Nepali. Now this is extremely important. Also important is Swiss, like us, because of that nappe formation, also have no oil. But the Swiss have been smart enough, they've got the OPEC headquarters there. So would you want the oil and have the resource curse, or would you want to have the OPEC headquarters in your country and all their money and bank balance maintained in your own country? Now this is a serious development question. Okay. The other topic is disaster relief and poverty. Now this is something that Toni Hagen got into as he began to work with the Tibetan refugees. Now what is really significant there in his work is the idea that don't give people fish, give them teach them how to fish. So his success, his innovation, because of his 14,000 kilometer walking across Nepal, showed him what people were, how they live, what the land is, what it supports. He was able to introduce this carpet manufacturing among the Tibetan refugees so that they could earn something respectfully and not live on handouts. Okay? Now, this also led to the growth of ancillary industries, wool production in Bajang and all sorts of funny places, and metallic paints for Thanka and other painting also that we had here. All that came about with this kind of an approach to disaster. That it was not, you just don't go to the people stuck with disaster and say, here are powder milk and here is this and throw it. You should make sure that their livelihood comes back, that their respect comes back, that they're able to get a livelihood that allows them to earn money and not beg for food. Okay. Now this was the critical innovation. He also talks about this income generation with an organization that I was the founding chair of way back in '92, the Rural Self-Reliance Development Center, or what is called Gramin Swavalaman Vikas Kendra, with Devendraj Pandey in Jharewa and all, where we started exactly along those similar lines of income generation. Okay, so it was not microcredit; the word hadn't been invented then. It was actually organizing the rural poor to be able to sell their skills. The kamis of Jharewa, who knew how to make iron equipment for agriculture, we were able to get them to use copper plates to make these utensils for puja, which sold for a much better price in Tansen Bazaar and helped them get out of poverty. Okay, so this is exactly the kind of philosophy that Toni Hagen was advocating and which we sort of internalized. The same was true with the green roads of Dhading and Palpa, which was actually not efficiency, using bulldozers and things to get work done fast, but getting people to actually, earn an income there. So our work with RSDC with the green roads was also similar to that of actually organizing the rural poor to earn a better wage by themselves. The Thekadar would have given them, the contractor would have given them 25 rupees a day. We were able to make sure that the 125 rupees per day labor price went to them. They came to Nepal, spent over 40 years here working, Odd Hoften from Norway. And a book is coming out by Mark Lefty, I hope soon, on Odd Hoften, and the whole challenging paradigm of development. Both have a similar paradigm of development, as some of us who are activists in this field do. Let's remember that Kulekhani was originally identified by Toni Hagen during his work, but he identified it as an electricity and transport project, a multi-purpose project for both things. Unfortunately, it again got hijacked by aid agencies and was built as a single-purpose hydropower only project. And now we are revisiting that to find out that 50 tons of fish could be produced in the reservoir, as villagers do. We're finding out that there are farm-managed irrigation systems in Rapti Basin that are actually using that dry season water. The industrial town of Hetauda, it turns out, could really use that dry season water for industrial and domestic purposes. That dry area, that's a dry dune valley, cannot otherwise have water. Now, instead of designing it as this multi-purpose project, we chose it as a hydropower project, and we lost a lot of the other benefits by unplanned development. important in both what Toni Hagen says, what Odd Houghton says, is the necessity to focus in hydropower development on capacity, Nepali capacity development, versus aid agency efficiency and outside contractors, consultants siphoning off the profits. Kulekhani is a great example. In 1993, when the cloudburst occurred and we lost Kulekhani because the penstock got washed away, many stations like, well, Nandikola, a few others built by Nepalis, by the Odd Houghton Toni Hagen method, were rehabilitated. Okay? Kulekhani, we found out, we did not even know the thickness of the steel of the penstock pipe. We had to bring back those Japanese experts, and we had to get money from the Japanese at a tremendous amount of cost to do that rehabilitation. So the question in development, from what Toni Hagen writes, comes back to this question of resilience in development. Disasters will always happen. There will be cloudbursts, there will be floods, bridges will be washed off, roads will be washed off, hydropower dams will collapse. Is there the capacity to rebuild it without having to go again and find these expensive consultants abroad to do it? Okay. Now, Toni Hagen has a lot to write on Arun 3 because he is helping us in that campaign. Now, a word I have to give because there's so much misunderstanding because of political party misinformation, all political parties I should say practically. Arun 3 battle was not about Gaida and Putali or rhinoceros and butterflies. Give us credit, for heaven's sake, us, people like us. We know there is no rhinoceros in Sakwasava, damn it. We're not talking about that. Arun 3 was about expense. Project five times more expensive than what Satluj is going to be building right now, 20 years later at. And that is what we were opposed to. $5,400 per kilowatt, when projects like that should be built at under 1,000. So that was what the fight was about. Okay? And Toni Hagen was a great help in all that, and he was helping us with all this. And the cancellation of Arun 3 was a benefit to Nepal, because we have got, and this is something that's not popularly known, we got a third more electricity at half the cost, half the time, after Arun 3 got cancelled. I rest my case. We don't need to go very much further. Hari Bairagi, the late Hari Bairagi, passed away tragically in the heart attack, managed to build in the same Arun Valley a 4 megawatt plant at $1,200 per kilowatt instead of the World Bank's $5,400. At the time when there was no road in Sakwasava, he managed to build it at that cost. It is possible, it turns out, but this is what the fight was. Now, and so Tony's points and this whole idea of the resilience not being there in that model of development stands even today. Okay. With hindsight, I have one difference with Toni Hagen. I should mention this. He after that the ADB money was put into Kali Gandaki, and some of us were still upset that the same model of development was being followed. The World Bank then happily was going to put the money into a power development fund to be available to the smaller developers. It still has not happened 25 years later, which means, it calls into question that should World Bank even be in development, that they can't even make a fund, okay? Whereas ADB was building Kaligandaki, and we were sort of, the high cost issue was still there. But Toni gave us advice, politically good advice at that point. He said, listen, you can't be seen as opposing everything. You had a success with Arun 3. So and you all yourselves said Kaligandaki, a few others projects are the alternatives that are cheaper. Well, you should let that happen. So we rested. And that, I think, with hindsight, was a mistake. Because while Toni was right that we shouldn't be seen as opposing everything, and we are not, we are opposed to bad development, not good development. The mistake we made with hindsight now, 20 years later, is that the political economy of this rent-seeking and gouging profit through construction contracts is stronger now than ever. It was there in Kaligandaki. Kaligandaki was built at half the cost of Arun 3. Good. But then still 2 times more expensive than it should have been. And that continues today. That Nepali consumers are really paying unnecessarily for excessively high cost electricity. It didn't have to. We needed cheap and reliable electricity to make our industry competitive. And that has not yet happened. Okay. And this is what Nicholas Hilliard, the editor of The Ecologist, when reflecting back on Arun 3 and everything, calls the grand licensed larceny of these privatized quote-unquote infrastructure projects. Okay. Now, if you think what Toni Hagen has said in hydropower development in his work is not relevant today, let me tell you one thing. Go back to looking at the MCA, MCC debate today and think again. There are issues of development that are there right now. If we go to transport, I'm about to finish, okay? And this is an area where we did work with Toni also. We managed to convince the British ambassador to build the Barpak ropeway. And Toni helped us bring the Swiss Army ropeway, goods carrying ropeway, for that purpose. It's all described in the book, in the chapter by Bir Bahadur Ghale and Shrestha, 2 different chapters. It's worth reading, you know. And this is, as I said, possibly the last chapter he wrote comparing Swiss development pathway. Now see, it's not to say don't build roads. We need good all-weather trunk roads that can be maintained, okay? But you do not need a road to every house in every hamlet, hilltop here. Okay. We were doing some research as part of our project right now on water-induced disaster, and we were in Patan and in several other areas, and I was shocked to find out that most of the Gaon Palika, the village, the chair that won the elections, most of them, their election manifesto said, and this is across Nepal, and it's a frightening thought when you think of it, okay? Their election manifesto of all the winners, okay, mostly from the UML, was, we will make sure there is a road to within 3 minutes walking from your house. Think what kind of a Nepal would have to be there to have a road within 3 minutes walking. I live right here in Patan, Dhoka. To get to the road, it takes me more than 5 minutes, okay? Karnataka takes you more than that to also get to a road, okay? But to have road for every Nepali house, in every hamlet, every hilltop, 3 minutes of walking, we are headed for this kind of dozer atanka disaster. I think Toni foresaw that as a geologist much before we did, you know. And today, much of the flooding in the Tarai is actually coming from the fact that these kind of roads are bringing down silt and sedimentation, raising the bed level of Tarai rivers and the water spilling over. The consequence of this is, okay, why are ropeways better, you know, goods carrying? They're 3 times cheaper to build than an equivalent green road. Green road, not the big highway. 8 times quicker to install. They can be installed in 1 season. Green roads take at least 4 years to sort of slowly widen. They can be dismantled and built elsewhere, avoiding technological lockedness. Ecological damage footprint is negligible compared to roads. This is mountain-friendly technology, and it's not a new technology. Chandra Shamsher brought it almost exactly 100 years ago, and USAID helped build one and rebuild that in 1964. Okay, around that time. It's 2 times more energy efficient. It consumes only 34 megajoules per ton of energy compared to 53 megajoules per ton for trucks. And trucks consume petroleum. This 34 megajoules per ton, half the energy cost, comes from Nepali hydropower. Now, so it is climate friendly, mountain friendly, but this is a technology that's not being pushed at all. And this is where the development debate really becomes very significant. This is where Toni Hagen's writings also point to this uncomfortable technological lockedness and the political economy that shuts off alternative possibilities. And this is the most dangerous thing. So I'll conclude by reflecting on some of his synthesizing experience and insights, looking back at his journey. And as George mentioned, and that's indeed the journey of many of us who started out as specialists in one area and then who had to make or had to get involved with other aspects and disciplines along our way. My electricity transmission line building in Dhoka actually converted me into an anthropologist. And this is recounted in the book. It's very interesting to see that much of your technical work and then the social reality there, these are things that hit you as an expert. And when you're working in the field, you find out you better start reflecting on them. So this is where Toni Hagen becomes extremely not just important, it's also very heartening, in moments of disappointment, because you find out, what's my discipline, what the hell am I doing, and then you say, wait a minute, there are others who've gone through this and come out better at the end of their exercise. The narrow expertise, highly skilled work slowly moves, towards opening up the unstated background behind such work, its context, its surprises, and relevance. This is also another important thing that comes out and reflects in many of our works also. When he moved from rocks to people living on those rocks, he had to also bring in a whole lot of other disciplines that people living on rocks have to encounter. So obviously there was the first thing was agriculture. As you move from geology and geography, it's agriculture and how are people living there. It's history, it's ethnicity and demography. He writes about all these things. It's rituals, language, culture. It's the challenges of global change, the stress of global change. It's the problems and the systems, system of governance and their shortcomings, hence politics. All these things come together, and as one moves from the harder to the softer sciences, one moves from what I would call concentrated uncertainty to diffuse uncertainty. From things only expert scientists can talk about to things everyone is an expert on, things is an expert on, and in truth should be an expert on. Every, informed and reflective citizen is an expert on politics, is an expert on development, because that is their lived experience. Okay. So there is nothing to be ashamed of to say that, as you get into these developmental issues, everyone is an expert. The issue there is, do we have an adequate platform for democratic discourse and debate about it? And this is where much of Toni Hagen's work comes. We differ. You don't have to agree with Toni Hagen everything. I already mentioned Kali Gandaki. I mentioned his assessment of monarch, which I'm sure a lot of people will not agree with, But what is important and relevant for the upcoming generation of Nepali scholars is Toni Hagen's background work and the manner in which he synthesizes and comes to the conclusions that he does. This is a great place to start new research in one's related field. Now, I close with a remark Ashish Nandi made here, the Indian social scientist here in Kathmandu. He mentioned in one of the debates we were having that new knowledge production in South Asia, he was talking about, bitterly about India. He said new knowledge production has moved outside of the university walls and is happening outside of the university walls, mostly in social movements, mostly in good NGOs and others. Okay. Now, Toni Hagen, I conclude, is one of such foci of new knowledge production. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. But you set the stage for question and answer now. We have at least 30 minutes of that available. We'll take them in batches of 4 or 5, please, if you don't mind. Could I see my hand or two to get things started off in terms of questions to Dipak? Please.
Hi.
Yeah. My question is about the advantages of ropeways in the mountain area. I come from Kerala, and I have not read the book Ropeways in Nepal, but I heard that it has discussed a lot about the advantages. My specific question is, are there some case examples in the villages where ropeways have been, some kind of success story where the ropeways have been used and people are benefiting from it? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. I'm Mr. Bin. I'm pointed on the point that Dipak Gyawali strongly disagreed with the approach of this Toni Hagen's top-down or down-up approach while he was talking about the tourism sector in Nepal. And Dipak Gyawali strongly praised private sector's role in tourism. And what I am seeing now in the Nepal is, private sector is doing well in Nepal in the tourism sector, but even our community also working on tourism. We have a collective culture, and so that in the five-star hotels we can find out many cultural shows and attires are being performed there from the community. But the private sector is doing lot benefit from that, and community is not getting anything. And there is much contribution in the tourism by community. And what the Toni Hagen's approach and your disagreement, is this is relevant, or how do you justify it? Thank you.
Just a conversation I had with Professor Hagen as well. I'd like to repeat right here. The Ghatu Nach of the Gurung and the Mogar. We discussed the point that it should never be brought down to the dance bars and dance restaurants of Pokhara or Waling or Kathmandu, because the Ghatu Nach should be danced as appropriate according to culture, according to the lunar calendar, in the villages where they are. So the tourists go looking for it. And I think what Dipak Gyawali was mentioning was that probably trekking tourism has links to the grassroots that many other tourism industries in the world may not have. But this is just something that I took off from Tamal's suggestion, question. But the point I wanted to make separately was simply that the discussion by Dipak Gyawali ji was mostly focused on infrastructure, development, a little bit of cultural issues. I thought there was one element of Toni Hagen that came to light towards the latter part of his career and involvement in Nepal in the socio-political sphere. After the Jana Andolan of 2006, Basati Trisati, Dr. Noble Kishore Rai and I were at his village in Lainzer Haide, and it was he who told us it is now time for Nepal to start focusing on inclusive development. And the term inclusive development obviously was there beforehand in other spheres, but that is where he emphasized this point to us, so that when we came back with the social science Baha, हामीले चाहिँ एउटा हरि शर्माजी हुनुहुन्छ, हामीले इन्क्लुजनलाई कुन भाषामा प्रयोग गर्ने भन्दाखेरि फेरि पनि हामीले कोइन गरे हैनौं, अरूले पनि गरेका होलान्, तर समावेशिता भन्ने शब्द हामीले चाहिँ एउटा कन्फरेन्स गरेर त्यो कन्फरेन्समा, because of Professor Hagen's input on inclusion, that is how, at least from our side, we managed to slip it in. So I'd like to recall Dr. Noble Kishore Rai and Hari Sharma ji also going here, just to make this point.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya.
Namaskar, I Durga Prasad Bhattacharya, belong to the Nepalese Buddhist Force, so I will address you as Minister Gyawali sir. Because once a minister, always minister, unless drastically progress. Wonderful, it was a very lucid, very powerful and animated presentation. I really commend that. And there were too many dots, you connected so many. And it's very insightful on many occasions. I can't say it's a question, but perhaps it's just a comment or partly question also. You mentioned about 40,000 plus kilometers he traveled, Toni Hagen traveled. It's Toni Hagen trail across Nepal. I don't know how many people have retraced that trail. Many people were trained by him, worked with him, and did wonderful work afterwards. And as you said, moving from one discipline to multidisciplinary approach, would there be any scope of making use, retracing and making use of Toni Hagen trail for instruction in multidisciplinary approach, not only limited to Nepal, but an example to the world, combining everything you said? Thank you.
Thank you.
Success stories, like two big success stories that we do have. We have failures and successes there. The failure is Nepal ropeways, and the reason it failed is the sabotage by the earliest truck owners and this was, Toni Hagen also mentions this in his book, by the truck owners when the Tribhuvan highway was opened up. Okay? And the political economy of technology is not very well studied subject, but it's an extremely interesting one, because people who are carriers of social carriers of technology are often not Mother Teresa's out there to make money. The two success examples that we have, the failure is that one, the two success examples are Bhattedana and Barpak, and the Khimti construction ropeway. Khimti project was able to finish its project in time because they quickly found out that waiting for forest department to give them permission to build a road to the access tunnels and all was going to take forever. If you're a government department, you can force the forest department to do certain things. You're a private sector, you're at their mercy. So they decided to do it by a ropeway, and that really helped. In fact, the figures that I used about how ropeway is cheaper in transport partly comes from our analysis of the Khimti cost. So that's half the energy it consumes compared to trucks, not counting the cost of transporting the diesel. Okay, by the way. So this is important. Now, more important, I think, in answering this question is the political economy of road versus ropeways. As Bhattedana and Barpak both showed, and both had their share of tragedies. In Barpak, the lower station got washed off because of a massive, unprecedented flood, and also misuse. Birbadur Ghale, I still remember, the entrepreneur who helped build that. That was meant to be a goods carrying ropeway and not a people carrying ropeway. People carrying ropeway, the engineering of it has to be 7 times in safety factor compared to a goods carrying ropeway, and hence commensurately more expensive. Okay. Now, what happened was that Rangrum to Barpak climb is 5 hours with the load. Okay. Now, this took 15 minutes. So what happened was, willy-nilly people started going on this, They were not supposed to. So when I told this to Birbadur Ghale, he said, Kya karne? I said, why don't you do it by weight? And he said the Western tourists were the worst. They were the ones who were using it most. Okay. So I said, do it by weight. Western tourists are bigger and fatter and you earn more weight, so per kilogram. He said, I did that, but they still pay for it. Then the answer was given by an old lady to me in Gorkha. When we mentioned this, she looked at me and said, sir, have you ever been on this twin, that Girling? I said, no, I won't dare to, Isn't this safer than the Girling? I had no answer. Obviously, a Swiss Army ropeway carrying, 150 kilograms is far safer than a Girling where you have to, pull yourself across. So technology has to be seen in terms of this. Now, but the political economy I want to drive at is this. When the Bhattedana Milkway was built, the transport was controlled by the villagers, the milk cooperative. When the road came, the transport cost was controlled by the truck owner. So suddenly now you saw that in Marxist terms where the exploitation shifted to. Okay. Now this has been the problem of roads in Nepal. Yeah, everybody wants a road and development, forgetting the fact that the roads don't carry milk and goods, trucks do. And who owns the truck? Not every villager can own a truck. Okay. So this is where the political economy completely shifted and led to the impoverishment of Nepal through a wrong choice of technology. That's what we're trying to drag at. Okay. Now, Kanak, and your question on tourism and the private sector's role. It is a complicated role. Okay. It's dynamic. It's constantly changing. Initially, my view of the tourism sector, private sector was they were doing quite well. Then the big hotels started, I call it cannibalizing culture, bringing it out of their context and, getting just, tourists to look at it and take pictures while, drinking and doing something else. So completely cut off from culture, which is also what Toni Hagen was driving at in much of his writing. You can see in the Swiss example where he said people went to those places. Those places did not come to a 5-star hotel. Okay? There's a huge difference. Okay? Now, on the positive side, let's look at Dwarika Hotel and how it was able to preserve a kind of old traditional Newar architecture. And now today we use these dancey bricks all over and we do all kinds of things with it. But that was not there until Dwarika Hotel came up, Dwarika Shrestha's imagination. And that would not have been possible if it was not for tourism. because he was packing all those carved wood in his farm, literally in Batisputali. And as he told me, he said, so much of it, he didn't know what to do with it, so he took all the wooden pieces and built a hotel around it. That's exactly what happened. But then it was sustained. Even the brick making had to be a separate brick factory set up. He even had to train gubajus, to the carvers with gubajus to figure out what each element of the carving meant. So you see that tourism did have, done properly, a sort of an element in actually preserving culture. But of course, there are plenty of good and bad examples of it being in a cannibalistic mode. And finally, on the Toni Hagen Trail, I think it's a really good idea, and I'd like to ask, we have the chairman of the Toni Hagen Foundation, Professor Jha, sitting right here. What I would ask is that two areas we look into, One from the tourism side, which are some of these areas where you walk, which still are pretty pristine tourism areas. And second is, I'm going to ask Govinda, you're a member of the Geological Society. Yeah. Geology students have to go all the time doing, their stuff, rock hammers and doing things. Can Toni Hagen Foundation work in these two areas with the Geological Society on one side and with the trail homestay kind of people, and call it Toni Hagen Trail, for geologists and for others, and develop them and see, and there must be some areas that we can at least hope will be preserved and will not be under the dozer atanka, So this is where I would suggest.
Can I add on this 1,000 kilometers, and you don't get 40,000 kilometers, in one go. So it must be back and forth, up and down. But
please introduce yourself.
I'm going the program.
हजुरको लाइटमा नमस्ते अलिकति बजाउनु बस्नु
To start with the trail, probably it makes a lot of sense to start the trail somewhere in the east of Nepal and go all the way to the west with north-south sections, crossing, in different areas. Maybe he has like tens of those north-south trails that cross the east-west. And those east-west trails must be not one or not two, maybe tens of them. So probably find the right one, the right east-west to start with, and then find out the north-south ones, so that step by step, keep on increasing those numbers. Looking at the feasibility, looking at different things, so that it is interesting for the foundation as well as for the people who do the real traverse in those trails. Thank you.
Thank you.
Toni Hagen Trail. I know very well his diary, what he wrote about the trails he found in the 1950s. And I myself, I did a lot of trekking since 1975. And what I found already, at that time the trails were much better than what my father found, so you cannot compare it. And the other thing, what kind of trail do you want to make? You cannot make a big trail. Nepal is a very big country. In Switzerland, maybe you can cross with walk within maybe 10 hours walking. You can start from lowlands up to the mountains, and you see all the different zones of vegetation. Here, this is too far. And the other thing, what I have seen, our foundation, not the Toni Hagen Foundation in Nepal, but the Toni Hagen Foundation in Switzerland, we supported once, there was a Swiss organization, Via Storia. They wanted to research about the Pilgrim Trail up to from Humla to Mansarovar and from more down. They stopped because you cannot preserve any trail. I have seen this now so many times, so nice trails. Now they are building everywhere roads, and the trails are disturbed. You cannot walk anymore on the trails. When I have been last year also in the Humla area, okay, I had to walk on the street. the street was, the road was more like a trail and not really as a road, but the old, nice trails with the stone stairs you cannot find anymore. So, in my opinion, I also thought we spoke many years ago about one should repair the old trading route from Kathmandu to Pokhara. You cannot, it's gone. It's by the roads, it's not anymore possible. So for me, there is no sense to make a Toni Hagen trail.
I am Ramon Kumar, chairman of the Toni Hagen Foundation Nepal. I am not a geologist.
Maybe.
Plant scientist. I met Dr. Toni Hagen first time in 1993, and since then I was in regular touch with him. As far as geology is concerned, one of my good friends, geologist Professor Dipak told me that Dr. Toni Hagen's geological work was, you see, he did a wonderful geological work in 1950 to 1960, but there was some politics or criticism or something wrong happened, and Nepal was dominated by the Japanese geologist, and because of that his work was not highlighted, or we can say that was sidelined. It remained sidelined for roughly about 3 decades. And later on it was realized that his work was correct, absolutely correct, and the Japanese work was not. So it was on the wrong track. Okay? So now after 1990 in Nepal, the geologists have realized the work of the importance of Dr. Toni Hagen's geological work, and now they are usually repeating or doing or confirming or whatever research they are doing on the geology of Nepal. Very recently, a book by Mintaj Dipal is on the geology of Nepal, and he has dedicated that book to Dr. Toni Hagen. And he is now on the board, executive member of the board, and very recently we invited the members of Geological Society of Nepal, and we are going to collaborate with them what we can do in this field. But that's only I can mention about it. Thank you very much.
I'd like to make a point trail. I would appeal to Katrin and make this point that in large parts, because we know that the map that Professor Hagen made in his book of 1959, it has the sketch of all the 14,000 kilometers that he walked in 9 years. Not 40, by the way, 14,000. Yeah, 1-4. I believe that there will be places that somehow got missed by the infrastructure developed, especially when they found a road would bypass a high pass. So the road didn't get built, and if there was no village in the high pass, then that would possibly be still a section of the Toni Hagen Trail.
I know a very nice pass which could be Toni Hagen Trail. He did not find the pass itself, and he got very angry. This is Namun Pass. And there will never be a road over there.
Yes.
I also crossed it. It's difficult to find the pass, and maybe this could be a very nice, and probably in future for tourism this would be a very good alternative, because now with the road in the Marsiandi Valley, it's not more interesting to walk up, but if you can start in Camp Pokhara or Siklis and cross the Namun Pass and come down, this would be a very good alternative for the trekking tourism.
There you have it. You got Toni Hagen Trail.
And may I just say a remark about the geology? I don't know, I'm working now together with Professor Pishalu Preti and also the Nepal Geological Society. And we are planning, or we are work now on the 3rd volume of geology of Western Nepal. For me, one of the worst things, okay, I have to look where is the manuscript, this is in German, this is in English, to put it together. But one of the very big problems I have is the name, is the road, the routing, the map, and the name of the villages. he used at time the map of the survey of India in 1930 or 28 something. And now I compare with the new map of the road of the department. And at least half of the names of the villages have changed. So it is very difficult for me, okay, this, he mentioned then this village, and then I look on the new map, it could be this one. And this is a big work and very difficult, because without this, nobody here has the map of the survey of India. Without this, the geological work is of no use, because you don't know where it is.
I'm Vishal, I'm at the Foundation. Thank you, Devotee. Your talk is always fascinating, and this one definitely has aroused interest in reading more of Toni Hagen. My question is, actually I want additional more perspective on the donors bureaucracy and the infrastructure development. Donors bureaucracy and the infrastructure development that you mentioned about, and you also gave the example of how it had a kind of negative impact on the Kule country development. My question is that now, since the donor seems to be kind of coming back to the infrastructure development realm in Nepal, what are the kind of 1, 2, 3 lessons to be learned from experience of 1970s and 80s now that the donors are more focused on infrastructure development? Lessons to be learned.
Thank you, Vishal.
About, my quick response to Catherine would be, we're not going to be going and reviving those trails just for tourists. I think it is important, but I think we should be doing it for school children. And the reason is this is educational. Take a school group on a Toni Hagen trail. Okay, it might still have roads and it might still have all the kinds of things, but try retracing those steps. What it will do is get these children to understand what their country is like and what someone about 50, 60 years ago did, what the country was like at that time, and you probably get a much better informed citizenry coming out of this. So I think the focus should be on school children also for the Toni Hagen Foundation and the Toni Hagen Trail that we do. In which case it doesn't matter if this has been ruined. You can tell the children, look how it is ruined. So this is a point to introduce alternative development paradigms, and this search for options, widening the options of development. And unless we train our new generation to think in these kind of terms of wider option, I think we'll be, sort of hurting ourselves into, past the cliff, as far as I can see. Now, Professor Jha, you sent me the abstract of 2 critical papers by Toni Hagen in your journals. Pratyush might like to, I'm not sure whether it's already included in your bibliography, but there's really interesting 2 papers, very recent, 1994, 96, I think, or something. And it's really well written 2 papers on 2 of your journal publications there. Okay. Then this geology debates are, like with hydropower, I guess, geology debates are also pretty passionate. And the fights are amazing. And because, someone once said, why are academic fights so bitter? And the answer given was because the stakes are so small. Geologists are just as bad as us hydropower engineers, I think, But then, for again, my thinking goes back to the newer generation of scholars who should be aware of all these fights and debates and all that and come to their own conclusions. So I think this is where we should really be going at, okay? And Catherine, the names of villages have changed. You were talking about something 50 years ago when you were walking with your father there as a child, okay? I'm talking about today, about a couple of months back. I can't find the villages where I did work because now VDCs have become Gaupalikas and nobody knows what the bloody old name was the new one is like. It's really confusing. So this is part of life here. There's nothing we can do about it. We just have to live with it and retrace things back and say this is what it was called before. Vishalji, I think this is a very important subject and a subject matter for really a major, talk or a day-long seminar at least and all. I'm really scared of the donors coming back to infrastructure, as they say, especially hydropower. First, they have not learned any lessons from the fight on Arun 3 and all. They have taken all the wrong lessons. That's my impression. Second, they're coming from a kind of a paradigm which goes completely counter to the kind of things that Toni Hagen or often people like us have been arguing. That is capacity development-led, bottom-up kind of a development. I mean, whether it's hydropower, whether it is tourism, whether it is, well, name anything, okay? I'll give you an example. The donors since the 1990s and worse in the 2000s, what they prided themselves, I know this personally with debates in London and Washington and all kinds of places that I do, they prided themselves on this whole thing about pushing more money through the system. Okay? Little realizing that in the process what they did was they corrupted the entire donor bureaucracy system. Now corrupted means, I mean, not anybody just taking money from under the table, that too, but not primarily. Primarily what it did was it created institutions, for instance in Washington DC, and if you have dealt with any American contracts on development, whether USAID or anything, or MCA right now, okay, you realize that the contracts are so, for someone like me with my kind of English, I can't understand the English. The legalese is so tough to understand. It has created a whole tribe of what, this is an American expression, of what is called beltway bandits. Washington DC has a beltway, ring road, the ring road they call beltway. Within that beltway there are all these companies, okay, where people, and there's a swinging, revolving door. They work sometimes in USAID as whatever experts, and then they come back as consultants and set up these companies. And they are the only ones that know which word will fly, which has to be done. And as a result, these are the ones that get the $1 million, $15 million contracts. And then they would subcontract it out to organizations like mine or yours or something for $50,000, $150 if you're lucky, okay? But their contract is for 15 million. Now, I'll give you an example. I was in Bangkok and as part of the Mekong River Commission and all that, and we found out that Stockholm Environment Institute in Bangkok had got $150,000 kind of a contract from a Beltway bandit, won't name it, which had contracted them out. They were very happy, they'd done great work, and I was sitting on the review. Until those guys quickly realized that the Beltway bandit had actually got $15 million for that project, had paid Stockholm Environment Institute $150,000, and what happened to the rest of the money, God knows, okay? Must have fed the American political process, all these big $1 billion donations, okay? Now, what I said at that point, and I'll end with that, is, I said, I'm so happy to hear this. We Nepalis have no choice. Okay, somebody gives you a $20,000 contract, you're very happy, you get the work done. We do that all the time. But to see that the Swedes get taken in that easily, I said, as a Nepali, I'm really happy.
Toni Hagen's life and writings, but it was an almost forensic examination, at least from Dipak's disciplinary perspective, and as Kanak nicely complemented with the rest of Toni Hagen's contributions. I should say, for a disagreeable person, Dipak, you only had 1.5 disagreements with Toni Hagen. That's very commendable. But the ideas around governance, the ideas around honest development, the commodification of culture, something that we have to keep in mind. I use the word commodification, but cannibalism is also good. The openness to context. And to me, this idea of openness comes from, not from rethinking, but from reimagining. And this whole idea of reimagining then is rooted in our training, our socialization from school, and of course in college and so on. I myself trained in politics and government, but I found, much to my chagrin, that I know very little about the other disciplines because of the way we were taught. And I'm rediscovering, for example, anthropology and history. But I was glad to see that you began by noting that Toni Hagen, as a geographer and geologist, his discipline was really multidiscipline and interdiscipline. And we can begin there and think about memorializing the Toni Hagen Trail by the socialization we give, of course, to children and then so on to geology students. I thought there are several takeaways from it, but I love the takeaway about doing a day-long workshop on donor dysfunction. I thought that would be excellent. And both Vishal and I work together these days. We might take that forward. We'll see. As you all know, we brought out this book on kleptocracy in Nepal, which some of you must have heard about. The last page talks about how complicit development aid givers are in kleptocracy in Nepal. Happy to talk more about it at the break. Thank you, Dipak, so much as a colleague at the Baha for stimulating this conversation. Thank you, Catherine, for gracing us with your presence and your comments, and for provoking even more comment and conversation as he always does. And for all the others who ask questions, I invite you to cookies and tea and more interaction downstairs. Just a reminder that the bibliography on Hagen's writings will be available within a month from Martin Chowthari, for those who are interested in that. So on behalf of Nanda and Pamela Shrestha and the Social Science Baha, I'm now required to give Dipak a gift for his remarks here. Honorable Minister, Dipak. Baha Cup. Thank you, Jay.
Birthday cake, $45.
Birthday